you shouldn't have been taught? Well, maybe a couple things, but kind of minor. Don't be too narcissistic. Don't think that you're better than other people because of your social class, which after all is how she was raised in South America. It was a very class-conscious world.
Yeah.
I remember once having a roommate who was Henry Ford the Third, who was Henry Ford the Second's son.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, I'm in Florida with my extreme right-wing Republican of the day, Bill Deere, and the Fords put me up for the night. And I thought the experience of the morning was instructive because it was so American, so not European. Henry Ford is in the kitchen when I make my way to the kitchen, and there's a Mr. Coffee. He says, "Hi, can I get you a cup of coffee?" And he pours it. This is not Le Comte de Chazelle, who is in fact having Marcel du Café pour Monsieur.
Well, it's better.
And he said, "I'm going to have some toast. Would you like some?" And he has this great big honking restaurant-style toaster where you can make 8 pieces of toast at the same time. And he pops in 4 pieces of bread, makes himself some toast, gets out some butter and jam and 2 plates, a knife, and he hands that to me to fix my toast wherever I want. And again, I thought, we're not in Europe anymore. This is not Dusseldorf or the Count Czartoryski of Poland. None of that. I mean, there's just not that. And it just sounds so cool. It's one of the things that convinced me later on to leave Living with Dad, which is that I really wanted to be an American. And I was being raised in such a fashion that I would be a foreigner. My accent, by people that within 20 minutes of saying, "Are you British?" We have a lot of Anglicisms, you know. And it was true. And, there was then very popular to use phrases of, "We'll have to see how that works in Peoria." And I realized I had no gut feeling for what the people of Peoria were like.
Where is Peoria?
Illinois.
Okay. I don't either.
One of those small towns like Flint, Michigan that became an important industrial center when the Midwest was an industrial zone of the United States. And then as technology went from 19th century to 20th century, disaster struck. The other thing they did in Peoria was agriculture. And so sometimes if the crop was failing or the competitors had a wonderful year or the price of wheat had dropped, the people in Peoria suffered. If GM pulled out a plant, the people howled. And so because they howled, they got the attention of politicians. And,
But what's your... Okay, so you remember DC is your first memories. And DC, and then Belgium.
Right.
And then DC again.
Right.
And then Cambodia.
Nope.
No. Oh.
Cairo, Egypt.
Cairo. Oh, that's where you met Nasser. Nasser.
We literally were we'd love to travel by ship if we could. If time permitted. Sometimes they said, "We want you here at a certain time," you take an airplane. But we literally were on a ship going into Alexandria's harbor as the royal yacht of King Farouk of Egypt was leaving. A historic moment.
And so Nasser was a general.
He was a colonel.
A colonel. Okay.
He worked for the head of the army was a 4-star general, Naguib. Naguib was a well-intentioned man who was a congenitally weak of character. He told a telling story where he was sitting next to Mom at our house in Zamalek, which is a lovely place to live if you can afford it. It's an island in the Nile River. Therefore comparatively secure. And General Naguib spoke French and told us of a very interesting story of how he had gone in to see the king to say that he had met with the forces of the Egyptian army and they decided the king needed to go. And with almost choking back his voice in tears, he said to my mother, "I expected him to slap me across the face and say, 'You dog, I am your king.' And I would have said, 'Yes, sire.'"
But he didn't.
But he didn't. And he was so disappointed in the king. Just this fat, pudgy playboy. So you could see that a guy like Colonel Nasser, who was a lion by comparison. This is Miguel. It's not going to work. And then Naguib was fascinated by the most childish and obvious of suggestions. He had absolutely no public relations or political sense. So I said, oh, there are people who are like not happy with my being president as named by the army, not elected. He said, you should be planting trees. And make sure to be seen planting trees. Asia, unknown. Yeah. Nasser used to practically like Putin show himself off without a shirt on, helping the laborers dig 6 shovelfuls of sand for the great Aswan Dam that would assure the glory of Egypt and its people's water supply, etc. And he would climb on a tractor and grab someone's beer, preferably a foreigner, like a Dutchman who would manufacture the tractor, and swig that.
But you liked Nasser.
Nasser was a patriot in every sense of the word. It doesn't mean you have to like him.
But you were excited when he would come to visit.
Oh yeah. Again, it was part of that. I take my son to, like Robert Frost said, a small boy should be seeing how grown men discuss things.
So tell me about how you would hear his motorcycles and run downstairs.
Yeah, well, I mean, literally, it's as though you had a particular corner of the house, and on the ground floor was a very large study with the doors and windows. Windows were protected by bars, but more importantly, they were protected by a lot of vegetation. You really couldn't quite see what was going on in there, and there were doors closed well as security. And it was therefore fairly quiet. But if you were in the room right above, you could hear these folks talking. Plus, the arrival of the motorcycles was kind of a hard time. Harley Davidson's, blah, 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 blah. Right? And so I looked in there, and I had first sort of frown, that kind of frown that means, shouldn't you be in bed, right? But it didn't necessarily say that. And Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had by this time become a politician more than a colonel, was kind of, kissing babies and all that sort of thing. So like, oh, son, picked me up, put him in this one.
That's nice.
And then Dad would decide. It was fun. And he would just give me that look. I'm like, remember, we've talked about this kind of thing. Shut up. I don't think he ever used the word shut up. It was more be quiet. But it was be quiet delivered by Zeus in person. You were just, you were.
He didn't want you to divulge secrets.
No, I didn't want you to divulge it. Everyone is terribly concerned about being embarrassed or misunderstood. What if you were saying something earnest that you didn't think your person you were talking to would necessarily believe, because they were coming at that situation from a completely different point of view. You didn't want your little boy that just be saying, that's a story, that's not true, But you would have lost faith, trust and confidence with somebody who was coming to you precisely because he couldn't stand the American ambassador and precisely couldn't stand the deputy chief of mission. So he liked the number 3, who was the political officer of the embassy.
That was your dad.
And Egypt is a version of going to Greece if you don't know much about Greece. You go to Greece and it's a bunch of fucking rocks, not good soil, no great harbors, some decent ones these days, with modern engineering. And yet, you see this temple to Diana, you see this, these Roman and Greek foundations of Western civilization. Architecturally, the more you do it, the more you just come away with, like, out of such poor agricultural soil came so much of enduring value.
Mm-hmm.
It's impressive. It's impressive. You would have thought, the guys had just had some satellites and airplanes, you would have said, we're taking over part of Anatolia, because with that we can feed people. We're going to take Syria, it's the great breadbasket, right? Instead of which they've got this little scrabbly shit that they fight over amongst
But
themselves.
they grew a lot of wheat, Egypt. I mean, the Romans needed them for wheat.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just in
But
the Nile
as the French
Valley.
would be quick to say, but nobody is advised to drink Greek wine or cheese. I mean,
I like feta.
you like, yeah, I know. What else you got?
That's what they have. You know?
Case of arrested development, a Franklin would say.
Did you like Egypt better than, let's say, Cambodia?
What I liked about Egypt is that Cairo in particular was a place where European colonials in Africa found that when they got back to London, when they got back to Madrid, when they got back to Lisbon, when they got back to Paris, having been raised in Africa, their outlook and their accent identified them immediately as colonials. And back in the home country, colonials from distant places were not held in the highest regard. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, if you're Lord Kitchener or, Governor Mountbatten or something. Sure, you'd be treated with respect, but you wouldn't have been in India that long. But if you were born and raised in India and you had Indian servants your entire life, and by the time you're 40, you go to London, the tailor is going to, in fact, sort of say, so are you back with us for a while? Meaning you haven't been here for a long time. Cairo was such a cosmopolitan city because of the colonial influence that if you were Belgian or French, you could go to Cairo and you wouldn't get the feeling that you're being snarked at. So there's a huge population of people who spoke French, some German, left back from the World War I period, and certainly English and Spanish as well, and Portuguese, which made it even more cosmopolitan. So you'd get these very earnest people from Belgium who turned out to be archaeologists, who wanted to make sure that it was done right in Egypt as opposed to the behavior of the Belgian kings in the Congo. Yeah. Preserving the antiquities of a people was something that took as well. So then my mother was still very cute, and you'd get these occasionally young archaeologists who would suggest they had a bottle of cold wine and why don't we drive out into the desert and let me show you some of the digs. It's a full moon tonight, my dear.
How did your dad react to those suggestions?
Well, fine. He just, in fact, made sure that there were 3 more cars from the embassy and some CIA agents or OSS to go along with them, Don't be ridiculous. Someone's got to carry that. Liquor bottles are heavy and the ice. The coolers.